You're listening to Bible Truth Feed, a podcast by Christadelphianvideo.org for Christadelphians and all those seeking the truth about the Bible message. Join us now as we present our latest episode.
So we are starting this week 3 sessions on the book of Zephaniah. And what a wonderful, dynamic, exhortational book it is. It was written in the final decades of Judah before Babylon descended upon Jerusalem and took them captive, at a time when Josiah was attempting to reform the nation by removing idolatry and reestablishing the true worship of the Father. And there's 3 prominent themes that run through Zephaniah. The first is, as our cover screen says, it's the day of the Lord, and it was near. And as we'll learn, it was a day of wrath and judgment, but also a day of redemption and love. Secondly, as it says in chapter 2, verse 3, the theme is, it may be that ye shall be hid in that day. And chapter 3, verse 8, the theme is that we need to wait upon the Lord until that day. And so although it was written in the year 630 BC, it's very relevant to us. The day of the Lord will shortly be upon us. And although it becomes more difficult, we must wait upon Yahweh until that day, that we may be among those who are hid in the day of the Lord's anger. Now, Zephaniah's mission was not to the whole nation. You see, their sentence was fixed. As a nation, they could not be saved. They were beyond hope. But his mission was to the individuals who would flee from the wrath to come. And he also forecasted the judgment upon all the nations on all sides of Judah. All the judgments seemed to converge together, ultimately, in the love of God for his remnant. You know, it's said that the love of God expressed in Zephaniah is hardly surpassed anywhere else in Scripture. Well, to look at a chapter breakdown of the book of Zephaniah, just to get our bearings, we have 4 sections. The coming judgment on Judah. Secondly, the judgment on the Gentiles. And then there's a short section that deals where God says why the judgment on Judah was justified. And lastly, the wonderful section on the restoration and redemption of the remnant. So when we delve into chapter 1 and verse 1, there's a unique genealogy given in Zephaniah. There's actually no other prophet that goes back 4 generations. And some of the names here, 4 of them, are quite significant. Zephaniah's name means Yahweh has hidden. Gedaliah's name means Yahweh has made great. Amariah's name means Yahweh has promised. And Hezekiah's name means Yahweh has strengthened. A very strong godly heritage, this Zephaniah. Now, there's 2 points that comes out of this. One is that it's over the years of some very wicked kings, Manasseh and Ammon in particular. And secondly is that Zephaniah was a descendant of Hezekiah. And so he was of royal blood, probably his cousin, and would have had access to the palace and the ear of King Josiah. And so he would have been an influence on him, along with Jeremiah. You know, this came during one of the greatest reforms in the history of Judah, Josiah's. And yet you'd never deduce that from this prophecy. And the reason in the history is found in the history of his genealogy. You see, Manasseh had the longest reign of any king in Israel or Judah, 55 years. And he was not only a wicked, flippant king, but he established a pattern of wickedness so deep in the people that God determined from that day that they would be removed. No king could change this people. And so we read in 2 Kings chapter 23. Now we know that Manasseh repented at the end of his life, but God says, notwithstanding the Lord turned not from the fierceness of his great wrath. And he said in verse 27, I will remove Judah also out of my sight, as I have removed Israel. You see, the decision was made there and then, in the days of Manasseh. So even so, Josiah tried to reform them. And so we read in 2 Chronicles 34 that after commencing the undoing of all that his father and grandfather had done, when they found the book of the law, he read it to the people. And it says, the king stood in his place and made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and with all his soul, to perform the words of the covenant which are written in this book. And he caused all that were present in Jerusalem and Benjamin to stand to it. And the inhabitants of Jerusalem did according to the covenant of God, the God of their fathers. Now, notice in verse 31, Josiah makes a covenant with all his heart and soul. But also notice that for the people, he caused them to stand to it. So the graves and the idols and the altars were purged, and the temple was filled with worship, but this was not in the hearts of the people. And it was Zephaniah who could see this. He could see further. He could see that the reform was a facade. And Jeremiah prophesied at the same time as Zedekiah and Josiah and says this, after witnessing the punishment on Israel, through Jeremiah, it is said, and yet for all her treacherous sister, that's Israel, Judah hath not turned unto me with her whole heart, but feignedly, saith the Lord. They had turned to God feignedly. They had done it in falsehood. It was a reformation by appearance only. And from Zephaniah, we get a picture of what those who live the truth feignedly are really like. Well, brothers and sisters, it's no good living the truth for show or to avoid the criticism of men, because God can see a facade. The word feigned in the New Testament, Greek, gives a definition as acting on a stage. And this lasted for the entire reign of Josiah. The people never changed. They spent their whole life in the ecclesia as hypocrites. And Josiah and Jeremiah and Zephaniah were constantly telling them and directing them. And we can imagine they always said, oh, yes, but they never changed. And so we read in Zephaniah 1, verse 8, that God would punish the king's children, but not the king. And the next 4 kings were his sons and his grandson. And even Josiah's family was infected with hypocrisy. So we'll look at the section that we'd like to deal with this morning. And it's the first section on the coming judgment on Judah. It was a warning to them. And so the breakdown is there. There's a warning of judgment. There's the day of the Lord's sacrifice. There's the day of the Lord. And there's the offer of mercy to the meek. And so the warning of judgment. Now, in chapter 1, verses 2 to 6, starting at verse 2, God says in this section, he speaks as if everything were full of idolatry and to be cut off through captivity. I will consume from off the land, he says. Young's literal says from off the face of the land. And it says in verse 3 that what he's going to consume is man, beast, fowls of heaven, and the fish of the sea. Now, when you look at that list, it's actually a list given in reverse order of how things were created in Genesis. So God is saying the magnitude of this judgment is so great, it would be like undoing the creation. And that phrase from off the face of the land is also recalled in the flood, where God also says, man, fish, beast, fowls are consumed from the face of the ground. And at the Tower of Babel, they were scattered upon the face of the earth. And so Zephaniah is saying that God is contemplating a judgment on Judah of this magnitude, on this scale, the undoing of Babel, the flood and creation, because similarly, this nation was beyond saving. It needed to restart. Well, in verse 4, he speaks of a complete removal of Baal. Now, have you ever looked at the word Baal before? It means the word Lord, but not just a Lord, a possessor. And in here at verse 4, the word Baal is actually plural. So Baal is something or someone or things who has a hold on us. And the Baals were all over in Zephaniah's day. The world had hold of the ecclesia in many ways. And he speaks of the Chemorim. The Chemorim were, the word means black. It refers to an order of false priests. You see, Yahweh's priests were in white, but they dressed in black. Now, it's interesting that Catholic priests also wear black robes. But these priests became known as the black-frocked Chemorim. And the verse says that they will be destroyed with the priests. They were all corrupt. So both priesthoods needed to be cut off. And where does it say is Baal and Jerusalem? It says it's in this place. In other words, the place of the temple, the place where God had placed his name to dwell and to be worshiped. And it was displaced by these kinds of priests. Well, brothers and sisters, what's in our hearts? What's in the place where God tells us that he wants to dwell and be worshiped? You see, when we worship the gods of the heathen, riches and pleasures and honors, are not these the idols that will be cut off? And yet God saw right into their hearts and said he would cut them off. Now in verse 5, it says that they worshiped the host upon the housetops. Now in Deuteronomy 22, there is at verse 8, the blueprint for a house in Israel. Every house was made virtually the same, with a flat roof and a guardrail around it so that they wouldn't fall. Now, in Exodus 30, there is the description of how the altar of incense was made. And if you're familiar with that, you'll know that there was a crown, very similar to a guardrail, that went all around the top. And so the point is, every house in Israel was a copy of the altar of incense. Every house was to be a house of prayer. And here in Zephaniah, they're using their rooftops to view and give homage to the signs of the zodiac. In superstition, Israel did this at night. In the day, they sang hymns with Josiah in the temple, and at night they did this. They were hypocrites. And also, it says that they swear by Yahweh and by Malcolm, which means king. So who was their king? Who is our king? You know, brothers and sisters, the scriptures have a lot to say about hypocrisy, feignedly living the truth. Just have a look at this survey here of scripture. God will not accept hypocrisy. Christ says you cannot serve God and mammon. Paul says a soldier does not entangle himself with the affairs of this life. Christ says, render to God the things that are God's and to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And James says, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. And so to fear, love, and honor God means that our fear, our love, and our honor is to nothing else. Now in verse 6, he says that he is going to cut off them that are from, let's just read it, and them that are turned back from the Lord, and those that have not sought the Lord nor inquired of him. The word from there literally means to follow. So it's referring to them that turned themselves back from following the Lord. In other words, those who had wholly fallen away from him, from God. They had left the truth and now followed their own lusts. And it says, and those, another class, well, they didn't break away openly, but they have not sought nor inquired of the Lord. And so in verses 2 to 6, we have this whole cycle, starting with the horrible Baal worship, the idolatrous priests, the priests who were in name only, but who mingled with them, not openly apostate. There were the milder idolaters, the star worshipers. Then there were those who unite the worship of God with that of idols, but whose real king was their idols. And there were those who had openly abandoned God. And lastly, those who stayed in the truth, but just to satisfy their conscience, they didn't really have their heart in it. God says in verse 2, I will utterly consume all, a warning of impending judgment. Now, verses 7 to 13, we have the next section, the day of the Lord's sacrifice. And it starts out in verse 7, that literally means hush at the face of the Lord. For the day of the Lord is at hand. You know, this phrase, the day of the Lord, it occurs 20 times in the book of Zephaniah, 6 times in chapter 1, verse 15 alone. He looks forward to the day of the Lord's judgment and restoration. And so in verse 7, it says that he's prepared a sacrifice and bid his guests. You see, it was a nation past saving, except for the remnant who would have been moved to greater faithfulness, at Zephaniah's words. And so the nation was the sacrifice. And the guests were the Babylonians, coming as guests to eat Judah, as it were, and so punish them. And the sacrifice would start at the house of Judah, specifically with the leaders and the king's sons, and then move to inspecting and examining and reviewing all the special spots in the society of the ecclesia. Now in verse 8, regarding the princes and the king's sons, you know, children, nowhere in any of the records of the Kings, the Chronicles, the prophetical books, are any of the princes or the sons of Josiah spoken of in any positive spiritual light. He goes on to say those who were clothed in strange apparel. The Hebrew for strange is the word foreign or outlandish. You know, in Numbers 15, it speaks of the clothing of the children of Israel. And their clothing was to have a ribbon of blue at the hem of all their robes around their feet, that they might remember all the commandments of God. So when they looked to the sky and saw blue, and then they looked to their feet and saw a blue ribbon, it reminded them of the glory of God. And that they were to walk within the bounds of the commandments and remember that they were a holy people. It says, lest they go a-whoring after the sight of their eyes. And so instead, these, particularly the leaders, interestingly, were copying the ostentatious dress of the Gentiles. You see, they lusted after their clothing because they lusted after their way of life. Now, brothers and sisters, isn't that an exhortation for our day? Now, in verses 9 to 11, there's a little section here, a sort of subsection, that is dealing with the commerce of the city. And so starting in verse 9, it deals directly speaking of robbery. It's what these phrases mean, those that leap upon the threshold. It's robbery, servants robbing for their masters. And it's either done by violence or deceit. But you know, what does the verse say that the master's houses are filled with? Are they filled with money? God says, no, what I see your house is filled with are sins, the the sins of violence and deceit, which shall be punished. Well, in verse 10, what would the day of the Lord be like? Well, there's this judgment coming, and there's this dramatic description of Babylon descending on Jerusalem. And they worked their way through the city. They entered from the north. And the first place that they would come to would be the fish gate, where the fishermen sold their produce. It was a fish market. And there's a noise of a cry, which means an almighty shriek. Where it says the second, the Greek really means the middle. It's the middle of the city. It's the business district of the city. And there's a crashing from the hills as the noise of destruction reverberates around the hills. And then they go to Maktesh, the main marketplace in the south of the city. And so indeed, the Babylonians marched from the north into the middle. They go through the south, right through the whole city. Historically, this is what they did. And there's a shriek, a howl, a great crashing, more howling. The Babylonians came quickly in judgment. And there's a reference there about the merchant people in verse 11, where it talks about those of the merchant people. The word merchant in the Hebrew, it's actually the word Canaan. And if you ever looked at this word Canaan before, we know it means to bow, because Canaanites bow to earthly things, particularly things of wealth. In fact, the Canaanites were famous for being dishonest, immoral traders. And so God insults Judah, calling them Canaanites, because the financial institution of the entire city was corrupt. And it's all they that bear. They bear silver. The word bear means that they are laden. They were laden with silver. And so these spent their lives getting wealthy until they were laden with silver. But did it help them in the day of Yahweh? We almost get the picture that they're trying to run from the Chaldeans, but they're so weighed down by their silver, it's slowing them down. Do we think that we're different? That wealth will make our lives better? That it will help us to be better servants, put us in a better standing at the judgment seat? You know, it's written that more often wealth brings foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction. And how much more so when this is derived dishonestly. And so in verse 12, he's going to search. And he's going to be sure that there is none of the guilty who will escape. You see, the word search is used of a diligent searching. It's in the intensive, where someone looks for people and places and things and sifting through one by one. You know, just put this up. It's used of Saul in 1 Samuel 23, where he says, "See therefore and take knowledge all the lurking places where he hideth himself." That's David. "And it shall come to pass, if he be in the land, I will search," same word, "I will search him out through all the thousands of Judah." Well, brothers and sisters, does not our Father search each day, each corner of our ecclesia, of our family, of our minds, discerning the very thoughts and intents of the heart? Well, what was he looking for in Zephaniah? Well, he's looking for those who were hiding, who were buried, as it were, because they had to be searched out with candles. You see, they were a little harder to find. They were those who were settled on their lees. They were comfortable at home. They're also quite comfortable with their character. You see, there's the need to stir the lees of wine during fermentation. That's the sediment from the pressing of the wineskins. It actually adds flavor to the wine. But if it's left too long, it makes the wine taste rotten. And the NET comment is that it thickens the wine into a syrup. And so there's the need to remove the lees by pouring it from bottle to bottle. Well, brothers and sisters, the point is, there's never a time when we should be satisfied with our development in the truth. Never when we should say, well, I know that there's this or that I need to work on, but that's good enough for now. Never a time when we can take a hiatus from the truth or retire from living the truth. And the thinking of these made them harder to find also. You see, they had a look of righteousness, but in their heart, they had the thinking that somehow God is not real, that he won't do what he says he will. It says there, the Lord will not do good, neither will he do evil. And so physically, these ones they were not in the fish gate. They weren't in the market. They weren't in the temple or in the center of the city. They were at home. They were at the cottage. They were hidden. They were seen every once in a while, just enough for you to know that they were there. But mentally, they thought, Christ won't return for a while. I've got some time. The Lord will not do good or evil. And so the Lord says in verse 13, your goods will become a booty. It will become a spoil. Their houses of desolation, all their plans of luxury would never be enjoyed. And so we move into the next section at verse 14 to 18. And so for those who were settled on their lees, and really for the whole of Judah, Zephaniah wanted them to know this section. The day of the Lord is near. You know, when you look at verse 14, it says, the great day of the Lord is near. It is near and hasteth greatly, even the voice of the day of the Lord. You know, if you remove the italics, it says, the day of the Lord, near, near. And the Hebrew is speeding. Rotherham says it's very speedy. So the day of the Lord, it's near, near, very speedy. You know, this verse, chapter 14, is quoted in the New Testament. You look at 2 Peter chapter 3, and starting at verse 1, for context, Peter says, I write this unto you to, stir up your pure minds. What do we read about? We read about those who were settled on their lees. And in verse 3, that there were scoffers saying, where is his coming? Well, versus those in Zephaniah's day who said, the Lord will not do good or evil. But in verse 10, the Lord will come as a thief in the night. Now have a look at verse 11 and 12. What manner of persons ought ye to be in all holy conversation and godliness? And here's the quote, looking for and hasting unto the coming of the day of God, wherein the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. He quotes Zephaniah, chapter 1, verse 14. The political heavens and earth in Zephaniah's day and in our day will dissolve. Are we looking for it, brothers and sisters? Are we looking for it fervently? Are we settled on our lees? Now, back in Zephaniah at verse 14, it says, the voice of the day of the Lord is as a mighty man who cries bitterly. You know, the NASB says, listen, the day of the Lord. In it, the warrior cries out bitterly. And so in the King James, where it says a mighty man, the Hebrew is a gibor, a warrior, a leader, those in whom they trust for protection. And a bitter cry is heard in the day of the Lord from that kind of a man, and all the unprepared who are with him. Brothers and sisters, do we desire to hasten the day of the Lord? Or will the day be for us bitter crying? Do we wish for the day to be today above all else? Because if we don't want it, it's hasting towards us anyway. And so he says in verse 15, the day of the Lord is a day of wrath. You know, how poetic it is in the Hebrew. It says it's a day of trouble and distress. Well, those are rhyming words. A day of tzara and metzukah. It's a day of wasteness, shoah, a desolation, and a day of desolation comes from the root, mishuah. It's a day of darkness and a day of gloominess, a day of clouds and thick clouds. Now, when you look at verse 15, what does this remind you of? Let's just read it. It's a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of wasteness and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick clouds. Remind you of anything? Let me recall to you Zephaniah 1, verses 2 to 3. I will utterly consume all things from off the face of the earth, saith the Lord. Man, beast, fowls, heaven, fowls, fish, from off the face of the earth. Well, we said it was as if it was God's intention to undo Judah, as if he were undoing the whole of creation. Now, does verse 15 remind you of anything? Let me read this verse. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Indeed, Israel and Judah were created for his glory, just as the earth was, and would be, as it were, uncreated for their disobedience. And so verses 16 through 18, we lastly consider these images of judgment that refer to an army. You know, it's an army who is never mentioned. You know, we know from history and the rest of the Bible that it's Babylon. But we notice in verse 17, I will bring distress. In chapter 1, verses 2 to 4, God says, I 6 times. In fact, there are 31 times in Zephaniah when God says, I will. What's the point? God wants them to know that it's he who's orchestrating this judgment. This will not be the doing of some greedy, oppressive army. This is God's doing. Well, we look at our last section, and that is starting at chapter 2, the first 3 verses, where God offers mercy to the meek. And so who would be moved by the words of Zephaniah? Well, there would be a small remnant who would listen. And God has this to say to them: gather yourselves together. Now, the word gather together in the Hebrew, it means literally to forage for straw, stubble, or sticks of wood. So the NET translates it this as bunch yourselves together like straw. So we get the picture of a man who's going through his yard, picking up pieces of sticks and straw, small pieces from his yard, to bunch them together to be burned. We'll just have a look at this quote taken from Barnes' notes. In order to repent, a man must know himself thoroughly, and this can only be done by taking act by act, word by word, thought by thought, as far as he can, not in a confused heap or mass, as they lie in any man's conscience, but one by one, each picked up apart and examined and added to the unfruitful heap, plucking them, as it were, and gathering them out of himself, so that they may, by the spirit of burning, the fire of God's Spirit kindling repentance, be burned up, and not the sinner himself be fuel for fire with them. Brothers and sisters, what a picture of self-examination in one word. And so Rotherham translates this verse, collect your thoughts. Hey, collect them. And so first, God calls those who would listen to examine themselves and realize, firstly, that they were part of a nation not desired. And so he says in verse 2 that there are 3 things to do, all prefaced with the word before. There are three things, but there are three things to consider. Before the decree and the day pass as chaff, because the days of grace were quickly passing. Before the fierce anger, the glowing anger, as it is in the Hebrew. Before the day of anger, which there means fierce burning anger. And so what he's really saying is, to the remnant, time is of the essence. There's no stopping it. Bring forth is usually used of childbirth. It comes and there's no stopping it. Chaff is thrown into the air. The wind carries it away. There's no stopping it or collecting it again. And so he says in verse 3 to the meek, those whose faith and strength is in God, also three things for them to collect their thoughts and minds about. Three simple things. Seek Yahweh, seek righteousness, seek meekness. There are three warnings and three things to do before the day, before the anger glows and turns into a burning flame. Three things to do. And then he says, it may be that ye shall be hid in the day of the Lord's anger. Do you know the word hid? Safan. It's part of Zephaniah's name. Hidden by Yahweh. You know, these are the very thoughts of David and of Christ in the face of trial. Just scan through Psalm 27, verses 3 to 5. It's a Davidic and messianic psalm. Though an host should encamp around me, my heart shall not fear. Though war should rise up against me, in this will I be confident. One thing have I desired of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. For in the time of trouble he shall hide. Safan, hide me in his pavilion. In the secret of his tabernacle shall he hide me. He shall set me up upon a rock. Well, brothers and sisters, our God is a jealous God. He will not share his love with other than his people. And so he demands that we love only him. May we learn from our father's punishment of Judah that we might be found among those who were with Zephaniah, among those whom Yahweh has hidden on that greater day of the Lord.
Ask for your careful attention as we call for Brother Wayne Katu to present his class, Zephaniah, Class 2.
Well, good morning, brothers and sisters in the Lord Jesus Christ and Bible students. Well, last week, Zephaniah began his prophecy in a very stunning and dramatic way. We can imagine him approaching the temple area and saying in a loud voice, I will utterly consume all the things from off the land, saith the Lord. I will consume man and beast. I will consume the fowls of the heaven and the fishes of the sea, and the stumbling blocks with the wicked. And I will cut off man from off the land, saith the Lord. And so his prophecy opens in verses 2 and 3 of chapter 1. He launched straight into this pronouncement of condemnation. And as we learned, it was in the days of Josiah. But it was based on a decision that God had made in the days of his grandfather, Manasseh, 3 generations earlier. And try as he might, there was no reform that Josiah would be able to accomplish. The nation as a whole was doomed. And yet, God still appealed to a remnant who would listen. Those who are among the meek, those who would seek the Lord and find a place of hiding in him. Well, in this next chapter, Zephaniah is going to proceed to address the nations immediately surrounding Judah as he continues to describe the day of the Lord. And so just to get our bearings and recall where we are, the breakdown for the book is, we looked last week at the judgment upon Judah. So this week, we'd like to look at the next two sections, the judgment upon the Gentiles and why it was inevitable that God brought judgment upon Judah. So we look at Zephaniah 2 and the judgment upon the Gentiles, the nations around them, and we see it's done in a somewhat orderly fashion. God is going to judge the Philistines, which were immediately to the west, the nations of Moab and Ammon, which were immediately to the east, Ethiopia, which was to the distant south, and the Assyrians, which was a nation to the distant north. And so, as we said, this was all foretold in chapter 1 and verse 2, that God would destroy all things from off the land, not just referring to Judah, but to the nations around them. And so Babylon was to invade the whole of the Middle East. And all these countries were going to be brought under the power of the Chaldeans. And Zephaniah said this at a time when, humanly speaking, this was completely unlikely. Chaldea at the time was nothing, and Egypt was the great superpower. And so the day of the Lord was to begin at Judah and then turn to the nations around them. And that would represent, as it were, the whole world. These judgments upon these nations, including Israel, is an incorporation of all mankind. And so, as we'll see, there's the nearby Philistines, a filthy, malicious enemy, they're described. Moab and Ammon to the east, who were related to Judah. And so, in a sense, they were heretical. And they were a polluted enemy that ever rejoiced at Judah's troubles. There were the Ethiopians to the south, and as we said, the Assyrians, which were described as a great oppressing power. Now, in verse 3 of chapter 2, we'll notice that the prophecy begins with "for." And so it's a continuation, really, of verse 3. And verse 3 finished off with, "It may be that ye shall be hid in the day of the Lord's anger." And so it's a warning to Judah that they consider, firstly, the fate of the nations around them. You know, it might have been easy for Judah to see the faults of others, but God says, well, they would be condemned too. And the second point to take from this is that there would be no refuge among their neighbors in the day of the Lord. There was no place for them to hide from the Lord, only in him. Now, as we work our way through these verses, it's very interesting. There's a poetic structure. And I think it kind of reflects God's poetic justice. And we think about it, God does use poetic justice. For example, Christ says, if you don't forgive others, God won't forgive you. If you deny Christ, Christ will deny you. Well, just consider this. When we look at the word for Gaza, it's the Hebrew Azza, and it means strong. Well, they would be forsaken. The Hebrew is Azuba. So Azza would be Azuba. It's a poetic play on words. Ashkelon was the great merchant commercial capital of Palestine, of the Philistines. Well, they would be desolated, desolation. And the Hebrew is devastated. It comes from ruined. So this great financial center would become financially ruined. Ashdod, which is in the Hebrew Shaddad, it means a powerful or a ravager. Well, they would be driven out. They would be forced out. So these powerful ones would be forced out. And it says in the heat of the day, in the broad daylight, when they would least expect it. It's not a time that armies go to war in the heat of the day. What of Ekron? Well, Ekron, the Hebrew is ekron, and it means deep-rooted. Well, they would be uprooted. The deep-rooted would be uprooted. And the word for uprooted is akar, and ekron is derived from akar. All of these poetic play on words. And in verse 5, we'll notice, woe to the inhabitants at the beginning of the verse, and there shall be no inhabitant at the end of the verse. You know, 3 of these cities of the Philistines were named for their strength. Strong, powerful, deep-rooted. And Ashdod had resisted for 29 years all the power and might of Egypt. And it was just completely unlikely, as God says in the judgment against the Philistines, that the remnant of the weak house of Judah would own all of the Philistines. And yet, at the end of verse 7, it's absolutely foretold that that would happen. Well, what of Moab and Ammon? So if you recall, Moab and Ammon were descendant from Lot through his daughters, and therefore they were related to Israel. They were cousins. And their background, of course, we know to be one of illegitimacy. Well, in verse 8, they're judged for reproaching Judah. And you see, the point is that reproaching Judah is equivalent to reproaching God. In Deuteronomy 32, at verse 9, it says that when the Most High divided the nations to their inheritance, it says the Lord's portion is his people. And it goes on to say that he kept them as the apple of his eye. And so blasphemy against Judah is blasphemy against God. And that's exactly what Moab and Ammon did. You know, where it says there in verse 8 that they reproached and magnified, and it says they did that to my people. In verse 10, it says they reproached and magnified against the people of the Lord of hosts. Do you know those 2 Hebrew words, reproached and magnified, are found here in Zephaniah, these 2 verses, and only one other place. And that's in Psalm 55. And it's a messianic psalm talking about Judas Iscariot and Christ, where it says in verse 12, "For it was not an enemy that reproached me," same Hebrew, "then I could have borne it, neither was it he that hated me that did magnify himself against me, for then I would have hid myself from him. But it was thou, a man mine equal, my guide, mine acquaintance." The word guide is the word for friend, acquaintance, someone he knew. Well, these were Lot's descendants, Moab and Ammon. They were Abraham's nephew. And so indeed, in verse 9, God swears by himself that this judgment would come, that they would be as Sodom and Gomorrah. And if ever there were 2 nations who should have known and learned from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, these 2 nations should have. Moab, which in the Hebrew means of his father, and Ammon, Strong says, means tribal, with the connotation of being inbred. Well, as we know, they were born to the daughters of Lot, right after leaving Sodom and Gomorrah. And so God says in verse 11, he will famish all the gods of the earth. You know, it's interesting, this word famish when you look at it, it's the Hebrew razah. And as in your margin, it means to make to make lean. But Gesenius goes on to say that the primary idea of this word is to be that of scraping or scraping away. And I wasn't able to confirm it anywhere, but I just have to think that razah is where we would get the English word for razor or to raise. As Gesenius says, it means to be that of scraping. And so we get the picture of God taking, as it were, a bulldozer to raise and destroy all the false gods and all the false worship of the world, raising them to the ground and scraping them away into a pit for destruction. And so, as we see in these chapters, with this kind of language and with the idea of Judah and Israel eventually overtaking these nations and dwelling in this land peacefully, it's looking beyond the destruction of the Philistines and Moab and Ammon to a day when all nations would worship only him. It's speaking to our day of the Lord. Well, in verse 12, God briefly mentions Ethiopia to the south. And Ethiopia really was associated with Egypt. They actually acted as their army at times. And historically, Nebuchadnezzar, who God says is his sword, invaded Egypt right after working their way through Judah. Well, now we go to verses 13 to 15, which deals with the Assyrians to the north. And they seem to receive a greater judgment. And what a judgment, because this is the city Nineveh. You know, we don't have the time to go through all the description of Nineveh, but it was a city about the size of present-day London, England, with walls that were 100 feet high, they say, that was wide enough that you could drive 2 chariots upon the top of it abreast. It was an absolute financial powerhouse. And if you look through the description of what would happen to them in verses 13 to 15, their city would become a desolation. It describes wild beasts roaming through the streets of the city. It describes birds being perched on the bare rafters of their roof. And it's because, it says in verse 15, because of pride. Because they said, and if you read verse 15 and take out the italics, they said, I, and none beside me. And this, they said, in their hearts. In other words, this is what they truly believed about themselves. And it says that they dwelt carelessly. And in the Strong, in Hebrew, it means to have both the fact and the feeling of dwelling safely, confidently. But you know, this expression, I and none beside me, is a saying or an expression that God uses about himself. 4 times in Isaiah 45, God says, I, Yahweh, and none else. And so this nation of Assyria, why they didn't just rival other nations, but they rivaled God himself. And just to pick up a point that we made in last class, although Babylon did the warring, did the punishing, Zephaniah uses language that indicates it was Yahweh who was really doing the punishing. Notice in verse 5, he says, I will destroy thee. In verse 11, the Lord will be terrible. In verse 12, ye shall be slain by my sword. You know, Nebuchadnezzar is called my servant 3 times in the book of Jeremiah. And so this was all to be orchestrated by God himself. Well, When we move into chapter 3, we have a section that I believe is important. And so we've made it a section all on its own. Chapter 3, verses 1 to 7. Because it tells us why. And it's instructive for us to know just what it was that caused God to make this decision of removing Judah as a punishment. And it's significant that it's here. It's placed in this part of the book. You see, God's been pronouncing judgment on the nations. And then he just continues right into Judah as if they were one of them. As if they were one of the nations. In fact, there are only 2 woes in all the book of Zephaniah. One is at the start of the judgment of the nations at verse 5, and here at the start of this pronouncement of verse 1, chapter 3. In other words, God doesn't even recognize Judah as his people anymore. He doesn't even call them Jerusalem, the city of peace. He calls them the filthy, polluted, oppressing city. And so what an abrupt and a stark charge this would have been to them. So let's just look at these words that he uses in verse 1. Filthy, polluted, oppressing. You know, we know that the world is bad, but when the ecclesia follows the world, it's worse. The ecclesia knows better. Well, the word filthy is in the Hebrew to be, both Strong's and Gesenius agree on this, that it means to be rebellious or defiant. So the main idea of filthy is to be defiant. To be polluted in the Hebrew means to be polluted or defiled or stained. To be oppressing in the Hebrew means to violate, to suppress, to maltreat. And so this is describing Judah. God says, Judah, you're like this. You're defiant, polluted, and oppressing. But just consider this. When we look back at the nations, and we consider the Philistines again, what were the Philistines really like? What was their hallmark character? Well, I'd ask you, who is the quintessential Philistine? Who comes to mind if it isn't Goliath? Goliath says that he was to be their representative. If he won the battle, the nation won the battle. If he lost the battle, the nation lost the battle. What was Goliath's famous line in 1 Samuel 17 and verse 10? I defy the armies of Israel. And defiant indeed are the Philistines. They've been Israel's longest running enemy right up to today. God says to Judah, you're defiant, just like the Philistines. Well, what of Moab and Ammon? What is their hallmark act? Besides considering even how they were born, in Deuteronomy 23 and verse 4, it says, they hired against thee Balaam. And the effect was, in Numbers 25, the people committed whoredom with the daughters of Moab. In other words, they were polluted by fornication. And so God calls Israel, Judah, polluted, just as Moab and Ammon were polluted, and continued to spill that pollution into Judah. Well, what of Assyria? We consider the nation of the Assyrians. Who would be the standout Assyrian in the Bible if it isn't Sennacherib and his henchman Rabshakeh? And the way that they oppressed Judah In Isaiah 52, it says, the Assyrian oppressed them without cause. So the point is, isn't it, brothers and sisters, quite stark. These were characteristics of the nations around them, but Judah was exactly the same. And so the reason God had to make his decision and was telling them that the end was in store for them was that they had become just like the nations around them. They reflected the world. They were the world. Well, brothers and sisters, we can't let that happen, can we? And in verses 2 to 4, the reasons are given why they were like that. Now, first to clarify, before we jump into these verses, there's a couple of phrases here just to make sure we get our understanding of it, because it took me a while to sort of figure it out. When it says that they were evening wolves, they gnaw not the bones till the morning. What it's really saying is that there's these wolves who, due to their hunger and lust, first of all, work in the night, and second of all, they eat their prey so that there's nothing left by the morning time. Not even their bones are left to chew on in the morning. And so they're thorough in their wickedness, and you might even say they're hypocritical, because they're one way in the day and they're another at night. When it says in verse 4 that her prophets are light, the word light means to bubble and be effervescent and to boil up. Judges chapter 9 in verse 4 says that Abimelech hired vain and light persons to follow him. In other words, these prophets, well, they put on a good show. They claim to have knowledge and to prophesy right things, but trusting them, God says, was treacherous. And so we read verse 2. It says, she obeyed not the voice, received not correction, trusted not in the Lord, drew not near to her God. There's 4 things. But have a look at verses 3 and 4. Also 4 groups of people. Princes within her are roaring lions. Her judges are evening wolves. Her prophets are light and treacherous. And her priests polluted the sanctuary and have done violence to the law. So there's a structure here. So you might say, she obeyed not the voice because her princes are roaring lions. They're not worth obeying. You might say she didn't receive correction because her judges were evening wolves and they were corrupt and hypocritical. She didn't trust Yahweh because her prophets were light and treacherous and portrayed God as untrustworthy. And she didn't draw near to God because her priests had done violence to the law and completely misrepresented the word. And so the corollary of that, brothers and sisters, for us is we must obey the voice. We must be doers of the word, not just a hearer of the word. Because if we aren't a doer, we won't receive correction. And if we don't receive correction, we won't trust the Father. And if we don't trust the Father, we won't draw near to him. And so the point is, we are all called upon to be leaders and examples in the truth. And I've seen it. Someone who's 8 years old in our hallway is a leader in the truth. People follow him and copy him. And we're called upon to be judges and prophets and priests worth following. Our decisions must be just. The word must be rightly divided. We must be ministers in prayer and in care for others. And if not, the ecclesia falls apart. Not just from the pressures from without, but from within. There's a cause and effect on others to the type of disciples we are. And so what does God say in verse 5? It says, "The just Lord is in the midst thereof." Strong says in the midst means the nearest part. In other words, the center, he says. And we find this phrase in verse 15 and 17 as well. And it's used, for example, in Isaiah 12 and verse 6. "Cry out and shout, thou inhabitant of Zion. Great is the Holy One in the midst of thee." So there should have been a realization of that. And it should have created fear and honor for God. In Deuteronomy, God says that he walketh in the midst of thy camp. Therefore shall thy camp be holy. So there should have been the realization that he was in their midst, and it should have created holiness in their attitudes. And shortly after leaving Egypt, when they were in Rephidim and they were thirsty, and Moses smote the rock for water, what was the real issue for the people complaining? They tempted God, saying, "Is the Lord among us?" The Hebrew, "in the midst of us," or not? They didn't believe he was. And so a lack of a realization of this creates a lack of faith. And in Zephaniah, at verse 5, it goes on to say that God will do no iniquity. And the Hebrew for iniquity is not just about iniquity, but it's the word injustice. And it's the same Hebrew at the end of the verse where it says, "the unjust know no shame." And he also says, "Every morning doth he bring his judgment to light. He faileth not." The word "every morning," it's a Hebrew idiom. In the Hebrew, it's morning, morning. And as it may say in your margin, it means morning by morning doth he bring his judgments to light. And you may recognize Isaiah 50, where it's Christ speaking in the prophecy, and he says, "The Lord God hath given me the tongue of the learned, that I should know how to speak a word in season to him that is weary. He wakeneth morning by morning. He wakeneth my ear to hear as the learned." And in Lamentations 3, it is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new morning by morning. Great is thy faithfulness. Well, brothers and sisters, do we believe it? Do we believe that he is in our midst at the nearest part, right in our center, and that every morning, morning by morning, he's ready to speak to us? Every morning he wakens our ear. Are we listening? You know, all we have to do is open our Bible every morning, and he will tell us of his justice and his mercy and his compassion. And it says in the verse that he faileth not. The Hebrew, adar, means to arrange as a battle, to muster. And so it's the picture of a military army, a military leader, mustering the army to inspect and ensure that every soldier is present, and he arranges them in perfect rows to count them. Or of a shepherd who perfectly arranges the sheep so he can count that every one is present, so that not one faileth. This is the degree to which our Father is there for us. He never fails to be available to us, to bring to light everything we need to endure and to succeed, if we would but open our ear. But it says at the end of verse 5, the unjust, those that do not open their ear, God says, They know no shame. We might say today, have you no shame? You have God right at your fingertips, and you don't avail yourself of the wisest, kindest, most loving mind every morning? Well, in verses 6 and 7, what other things did he bring to light every morning? Well, it says he brings to light his righteousness, if we read what he's saying. You see, Judah was meant to learn from what God did to the other nations. See in verse 6, I've cut off the nations. Their towers are desolate. I made their streets waste, that none pass by. So their cities are destroyed, and so that there is no man, there is none inhabitant. And then I said to Judah, surely thou wilt fear me. Thou wilt receive instruction, so that their dwelling should not be cut off. Yet, howsoever I punished them, they rose early and corrupted all their doings. He had cut off nations because they were iniquitous, and he expected Judah to learn from his example of righteous judgment upon sin, so that they would not be cut off, so that they would receive instruction from his example. But they did not. What did they do instead when God rose morning by morning, every morning? At the end of verse 7, they rose early and did the opposite. They corrupted all their doings. They didn't learn from viewing how God punished the sin of other nations. There was no response to the consequences he placed on them, so there is no alternative but to destroy their nation. Jeremiah in chapter 3 basically summarizes this and says the same thing, where God says, I saw when for the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a bill of divorcement. What does he say? Yet her treacherous sister Judah feared not, but went and played the harlot also. So the point is, brothers and sisters, we need to be moved with fear at God's justice, his judgment of sin, and the consequences that he lays out in his word. We need to be moved to obedience because God describes them in detail so that we do learn. We should learn. Well, in conclusion, God removed Judah from his presence because, they'd become just like the nations around them. They become exactly like the world. From the time of King Solomon, the establishment of the nation, to the days of Manasseh, when God made the decision to remove Judah from the land, was 285 years. But we know that Judah didn't just wake up on the 285th year, and that morning they were like the world. It was a slow downward trend where the world insidiously crept into their minds. Well, Brother Thomas first used the name Christadelphian 158 years ago. You might say we're more than halfway there. It's not in fashion today to say you're different, is it? In fact, you'd probably be called unloving if you stood apart from society for godly reasons. But brothers and sisters, do we honor the heritage of the truth that we have? Are we embarrassed to use the word ecclesia instead of church because, we don't want others to feel comfortable and we want to be a little more inclusive? Do we think that Bible marking in a wide margin Bible is old-fashioned? It's not an exciting or up-to-date method of studying? Do we think that Christadelphian speakers are kind of dry and pick boring topics, so we like to listen to Christian talks that we can relate to? Do we think our hymn book is out of date and that Christian pop music has more feeling? Brothers and sisters, all these things and more. We maintain our statement of faith. We believe in a literal 7-day creation. We believe that marriage is between only a male and a female. May we never apologize for these things. Never be embarrassed by these things. May we honor them as our heritage, as part of the foundation of the truth that can easily be lost. Lest our God should say unto us, like he said unto Judah, woe unto her. Having thundered his judgments, Zephaniah, particularly on Judah, and telling them that God had inspected every little segment of their society and found their ecclesia to be corrupt. And so upon them would come the judgments of the day of the Lord. Well, then Zephaniah proceeded to tell Judah that these judgments would incorporate all the nations around them, that there would be no place for them to hide on that day. And sadly, it was because that they were just like those nations. Their ecclesia was just like the world. Well, Zephaniah is now going to explain the other side of the day of the Lord, that God was going to work with the remnant in Judah, the meek, those who took the exhortation that knowing that Yahweh was in their midst, they hid themselves in the Lord. They waited upon him. And that's why the day of the Lord is not only a day of judgment, but it's a day of love. It reflects the two aspects of the Father's character, doesn't it? His severity and his goodness. It's justice and mercy. It's truth and mercy. And so to look at this section in particular then, in chapter 3, we see that it deals with the restoration and the redemption of Judah. And we notice how God uttered his judgments against Judah and and the nations around them. And so this section is going to deal with their restoration to favor again, both of the nations and the whole of the nation of Israel. And lastly, it's going to describe how God will manifest himself in his great love for his people. Now, just a little note about timing here in Zephaniah. Zephaniah has been dealing with Judah in the days of Josiah and the judgments that would come upon his descendants. And so this section of the book is really forecasting the restoration of Judah after their captivity in Babylon. But just as so many other parts of Scripture have a double application, well, some of this language in this chapter of Zephaniah can only apply to the day of the Lord when Christ has returned. It's our day of the Lord and the ultimate restoration of his people when Christ will sit as king. And so we are going to be involved in the things of this chapter. Well, starting then with the nations converted, verses 8 till 10. And verse 8 starts out with therefore. So it's connecting to what's before. And recall that last week in verses 6 and 7, God expected Judah to learn from his judgments on the nations around them and on Israel to the north as well. But they would not. They continued in their corruption. And so, therefore, he now speaks once again to those of chapter 2 in verses 1 to 3, the meek of the earth who had wrought his judgment. And so, in that day, he says, wait upon me. Now, the word for wait comes from the idea in the Strong's of piercing, properly to adhere to, and so to await. And so really God is saying, look, therefore, ye meek of the earth, be pierced and nailed and so stuck to me, and wait with a longing and persevering expectation, because the day of the Lord will require patience on your part. But remember what it said about the day of the Lord. He said it's coming. It's even speeding along, and there's no stopping it. So it's really just a perceived delay on their part, or our part. And so wait ye upon me, God says. Well, what do they wait for? What are the meek waiting for? Well, he says in the verse, until the day that I rise up to the prey. Now, it's a rather interesting picture that this verse creates, because the question is, who is the prey? Well, when you look at verses 9 and 10, God's not gathering the nations to exterminate all of them, but he's going to refine them and sift them, and sift out that he might obtain those who would confess his name. And so it's those individuals, the ones who will be obedient to him, that he's viewing as his prey, that he wants to find. And so he says he's going to gather and assemble the nations. You know, the nations, it would seem, think that they gather for their own means. They gather for war, to take their own prey. But it says here that God is the one doing the gathering. And we might think of Ezekiel 38, where God says to Gog, I will put hooks into thy jaws and draw thee down. And so the verse goes on to say that I may assemble the nations to pour upon them mine indignation. For all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy. Now, the word indignation, in the Hebrew, it means to froth at the mouth. I mean, what a picture we get from this word. And the word fierce anger means the burning of anger in the face. We might say someone's so angry that they get red-faced. And the fire of his jealousy, well, it literally means the fire of jealousy. And so, you know, we think about it, and we say to ourselves sometimes, well, how much longer is it going to be until Christ returns? And we say, God must look down in such anger at the degree of sin in the world. Well, brothers and sisters, let's not make a mistake here. God is angry, and he's jealous at the institutions of religion and wealth and science and philosophy, which completely delude men from looking to their Creator. They work to remove his very existence from men's minds. But you know, all you have to do is just glance at the odd headline or listen to a little news report here and there, and you can see the angels now at work, gathering and assembling the nations. And just when they think they will accomplish their goal, God's going to pour upon them the full force of his indignation and his wrath. And so God's instruction to us is, wait ye upon me. And you know, sometimes it feels like all we can do is wait. When life seems to be filled with, to use some of the things of chapter 1, those who worship the host of heaven, or those who are turned back from the Lord, who say, oh, the Lord won't do this or do that. And we know we're completely surrounded by this in the world. And sometimes it even seeps into the ecclesia. Or when we feel tired from the constant gnawing of the flesh upon us. Or when we feel our bodies grow weak and sick because of our mortality. Brothers and sisters, it's all we can do is to wait upon the Lord, to be nailed to him, to be stuck to him, and wait with a longing and persevering expectation. Because soon enough, in verse 9, it says, I will turn to the people a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent. You know, we're back in Genesis again. Zephaniah is appealing to Genesis again. This is the reversal of the Tower of Babel, where in that case, the language and the unity of man were united against God. But here, they will be united in one language with God. And sometimes we say, well, you know, the language of the kingdom, it's going to be Hebrew. And it seems that this verse might actually be implying that, because the commentators say that this verse that talks about one language is the only verse in the entire Bible that contains every letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The Hebrew alphabet. And it says they're going to serve him with one consent. And your margin may have a note there that it's one shoulder. Well, this Hebrew word for consent is actually the word Shechem. Shechem, it's the place, isn't it, that's pregnant with meaning and significance. It's the place where Abraham returned to make a different decision. Shechem is the place of decision. And so this verse is saying that the nations that are left, God is not going to need to coerce them. They will choose to serve God. And so the chastisement on the obstinate nations will lead to the conversion of the others. And this is confirmed in verse 10. It says that from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my suppliants, even the daughter of my dispersed, shall bring mine offering. Now, just to clarify some of the words here in verse 10, suppliant, it comes from the word incense, hence a worshiper. The NET Hebrew notes on this verse, or this word, say, those who pray to me. And the daughter of my dispersed, well, this word dispersed, which simply in the Hebrew means scattered, 31 out of the 66 times that this word comes up in the Bible, it refers to Israel. And the word for offering, well, it's actually the word for a meat offering or a meal offering. And so Kyle and Delitzsch translates this verse 10 as, from beyond the rivers of Cush, they will bring my worshipers, the daughters of my dispersed ones, as a meat offering unto me. And so how interesting that the meat offering was an offering that was to show good works. And so this verse is saying that even the most remotest of Gentile nations will prove that they are the worshipers of Yahweh by bringing the scattered members of his nation Israel back to their land. They're going to help God accomplish his plan. And so that's the restoration of the nations. Well, now turning to Israel. Israel's shame being removed in verses 11 to 13. Now, verse 11 is kind of a bit of a difficult translation. So in that day, in other words, he's hearkening back to verse 8, in the day that God rises up to the prey. Now, some versions have the first half of this verse as a question, but it's actually not in the Hebrew. The King James has it correct. It's stating that there's no need for Israel to be any longer ashamed of their iniquities. And the verse explains it's because those iniquities don't occur anymore. And it says that God will take away them that rejoice in thy pride. Well, numerous translations say, thy proudly exalting ones. Thy proudly exalting ones will be taken away. And it's obviously referring to the princes and the judges and the prophets and the priests of verses 3 and 4 in this chapter. And where it says that they will be no more haughty, well, in the Hebrew, it's the same Hebrew word as pride in this verse. And lastly, the word because, I think there's a note in your margin that says it's actually in or upon. And so putting all of this together for verse 11, the NET does a nice job. It says, in that day, you, Israel, will not be ashamed of all your rebelliousness against me. For then I will remove from your midst those who proudly boast, and you will never again be arrogant on my holy hill. So, my holy hill, why that's Mount Zion, isn't it? That's the place of the temple, the place where so much of the law was meant to teach humility before God, to be shown to him and to others. Well, brothers and sisters, this applies to us too, doesn't it? This is God's ecclesia. And sometimes we might smugly think, well, I'm a Christadelphian and I uphold the truth. I'm one of the few in the world that know the truth. And we can sometimes twist the truth into a source of pride. Our flesh is capable of doing that. But we need to remember that God does not tolerate pride of any sort. And so verse 12, I will leave in the midst of thee an afflicted and poor people, and they shall trust in the name of the Lord. The poor and afflicted, those who know that deliverance will only come through the grace of God, and so they trust in him. This is their leading characteristic. They trust Yahweh. Versus the proud, why they trust in their own strength, in their own accomplishments, in their holiness, and they boast about it. And so in verse 11, it says he's going to remove out of the midst of thee the proud, and in verse 12, he's going to leave in the midst of thee these poor and afflicted. And verse 13 is really saying that these poor and afflicted, why they make up the remnant of Israel, who will finally fulfill what God wanted the nation to be, a holy nation. It says they will do no iniquity. Well, that phrase is in verse 5, where it says God will do no iniquity. And it's actually the same Hebrew word. They're going to be like a flock, it says. They're going to feed. In the Hebrew, it's the word for graze. And they're going to lie down, and none shall make them afraid. And none's going to make them afraid because the roaring lions and the evening wolves of verse 3, well, they've been removed out of their midst. And they're going to have Christ as their shepherd. And you know, brothers and sisters, this remnant of Israel, it's going to be our responsibility as part of that multitudinous Christ to lead them and to teach them of the principles of Christ. Well, our last section starts in verse 14, and we've called it the manifestation of Yahweh. It's going to use such beautiful words that God is going to use to enthuse us about the kingdom of God. And just a note, they say that the verbs in the Hebrew in this section are all in the perfect tense. In other words, they've been written as though it's already happened. That's the surety of these things happening. Well, verse 14 starts with 3 exaltations. Sing, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O Israel. Be glad and rejoice with all the heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. So 3 exaltations and also 3 terms used for the people. They are called Zion. They're called the temple. They're called the nation, Israel, and they're called Jerusalem. Well, Zion, recall, is where the Holy Hill is. It's referring to the temple. And to call them Israel, why, that refers to them as a nation. And to call them as Jerusalem, well, Jerusalem is the capital. And so it's referring to the government. And with the Lord in their midst, as it says in the next verse, verse 15, he's in their midst. It's really Christ in this case, isn't it? Manifesting the Father. So really, we have here described for us the establishment of the kingdom of God in the kingdom. And you know, these 3 terms, Zion, Israel, and Jerusalem, are only used together of one other event in the Bible. Now, you'll find them in Joel 3:16, but that's really referring to this event, the ultimate establishment of the kingdom when Christ is in the earth. But the only other event that it refers to is in 1 Kings chapter 8, where it says Solomon has assembled the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes, the chief of the fathers of the children of Israel, unto the king in Jerusalem, that they might bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. And you know, this is the same thing, isn't it? It's the establishment of the kingdom of God, but it's in type. With Solomon, who means peace, in the type as Christ, there, in the establishment of the kingdom. And you know, at the end of this 1 Kings chapter 8, at verse 66, it says that on the 8th day he sent the people away, they blessed the king, and went unto their tents, joyful and glad of heart for all the goodness that the Lord had done for David his servant. And that word joyful, which means glad, it's the same word found in Zephaniah 3 and verse 14. And it says that they were glad of heart. Just as in Zephaniah, they were told to rejoice with all the heart. Only in Zephaniah, rejoice literally means to jump for joy with all the heart. Because it's not the type, the real thing would finally be here. And in verse 15, isn't it interesting that there are 3 reasons given for them to exult? And that is that he has taken away thy judgments. In other words, they've been forgiven. Well, those are the issues of the temple, aren't they? He's cast out thine enemy. In other words, he's saved them. He's saved the nation. And Yahweh is in the midst of thee. Well, he's the king. In other words, it's the establishment of the government. And so it says at the end of verse 15, thou shalt not see evil anymore. And so in verse 16 it says, in that day it shall be said to Jerusalem, fear not, and to Zion, let not thine hands be slack. Well, the NET kind of adds a little bit of color to the verse. It says, on that day they will say to Jerusalem, don't be afraid, Zion. Your hands must not be paralyzed from panic. And the reason is given in verse 17. It's because the Lord your God is in the midst of thee. Well, who would it be that's in the midst of thee, representing Yahweh? Well, the verse says that he's mighty. Now, this word mighty, we've seen that before. The word mighty is the Hebrew gabor. It means a mighty man, or by implication, a warrior. And then a verse goes on to say, he will save. In the Hebrew, the words Yah Shua. Well, that's the word in the Hebrew, the name Joshua. Or in the Greek, it would be Jesus. He's in the midst of thee, and he will be a warrior who will save thee. Now, I don't know if you've noticed as we've gone through the book of Zephaniah, and particularly in this chapter 3, how often we come across the term in the midst of thee. And it creates a story in this chapter, this phrase, in the midst. So in verse 5, the emphasis was that Yahweh was in the midst. He was in the middle, in the very center. And the verse said that morning by morning, he brings his judgment to light. And the result of him being in the midst is that judgment would come on those who would not listen. And these proud ones would be removed. And so the result would be there would only be the poor and afflicted who would be left, those who would listen each morning and crave for the judgments of Yahweh. Well, that would result in the poor and afflicted not seeing evil anymore because Yahweh is in the midst of thee. And why that would result in Yahweh, he who will save thee, dwelling in their midst, rejoicing in joy, resting in his love. And if he's in their midst, why, that means that he's no longer hidden. He's no longer hiding his face, and there's no longer the need for the remnant to be hidden from their oppressors. Well, what would this time be like? What would the feelings be like at that time? And in particular, what would the feelings of the Father and the Son be towards these humble and poor and afflicted people of the Lord? Well, it says in verse 17 that he will rejoice over thee with joy. He will rest in his love. He will joy over thee with singing. So he's going to rejoice over thee with joy. And the Hebrew for joy is to be bright and cheerful. Gesenius says it's from the idea of to spring and to leap. To rest in his love, your margin will say that he will be silent. He will have this unutterable yearning for them in silence, just as they would have had for him. And the word also carries with it an implication that he will remember sin no more. And then it says that there will be this breaking forth into joy over thee with singing. And this Hebrew word for joy literally means to spin around with emotion. And so what a scene, isn't it? That the Father and his Son and us, as part of the multitudinous Christ, will rejoice and be glad over the redeemed remnant of Israel. And then pause and have a silent reflection of love and admiration. And then burst into a dance with this unashamed joy and exultation. You know, this is describing the emotions of God himself in terms of the emotions of a man, so that we could relate to how God is going to feel about his people at that time. But you know what we need to remember is, if he's going to feel like that about his people Israel, it means that he's already done that in this verse over us at our judgment, when we've been given physical immortality, to be a part of him, to be united with him. You know, in life, we long to love someone and we long to be loved by someone. And we are going to be loved by the Father at our response to the obedience of his offer of grace and mercy in the knowledge of the truth. You know, this is such an amazing verse that I just had to include this little quote from Barnes' notes. And he says, "This love and joy the prophet speaks of as an exuberant joy, one which boundeth within the utmost self, and again is wholly silent in his love, as the deepest, tenderest, most yearning love broods over the object of its love, yet is held in silence by the very depth of its love. And then again breaks forward in outward motion and leaps for joy and uttereth what it cannot form in words. For truly the love of God in its unspeakable love and joy is past belief, past utterance, past thought." So have you ever thought that our response to the love of God towards us, our behavior and our words as we struggle to live the truth, could affect the very emotions of the Father himself? And yet that's what this verse is saying. Well, verse 18 goes on to say, "I will gather them that are sorrowful for the solemn assembly who are of thee, to whom the reproach of it was a burden." It's kind of a difficult translation to kind of grasp what it's saying, but I think the ASV does a bit of a better job. It says, "I will gather them that sorrow for the solemn assembly, who were of thee, to whom the burden upon her was a reproach." You know, it's describing them who love and are concerned for the truth, who could either not attend the solemn assembly, or maybe they were in exile, or their leaders made a mockery of it, and it brought reproach upon the truth and upon the ecclesia. And this remnant saw that reproach upon the nation and bore it as a reproach upon themselves, because they loved the truth and they loved their nation and the ecclesia. Well, brothers and sisters, do we sometimes feel that way? Do we sorrow when we're too ill or frail to be in the solemn assembly? Or sometimes when we see the truth or the ecclesia suffer reproach because of controversy or because the world creeps in and we bear it as a reproach upon ourselves? Well, this verse is saying that God will gather those. And so in verse 19, "Behold, at that time I will undo all that afflict thee, and will save her that halteth, and gather her that was driven out, and will get them praise and fame in every land where they have been put to shame." You know, this word halteth in the Hebrew is only used 3 times in the Bible. It's used in Genesis 32 of Jacob when he halted upon his thigh. It's used in Micah chapter 4, referring to the regathering of Israel. And it's used here. And so this is speaking of the saving of Israel by the multitudinous Christ from the Esau nations of the world. And in verse 20, "At that time I will bring you again, even in the time that I gather you, for I will make you a name and a praise among all people of the earth, when I turn back your captivity before your eyes, saith the Lord." You know, this is a fulfillment of Deuteronomy chapter 26 in verse 19. It uses the same Hebrew words, actually, where Moses said that if they would be obedient, then God would make thee high above all nations which he hath made, in praise and in name and in honor, that thou mayest be a holy nation unto the Lord thy God, as he hath spoken. Well, how far we've come. What a change. What a reversal from the beginning of the book. And you know, if we've suffered affliction, if we feel like we've halted along in life, if we've been driven out, as the verse says, because of infirmity or those who would rule over us of the world, or because yet again we have sin to confess, well, brothers and sisters, he will bring back your captivity. He'll bring back our captivity, just as he brought back the captives from Babylon, and just as he's going to bring back the captives from the coming Russian oppression. He's going to release us from our flesh. Paul says when he ascended on high, he led captivity captive and gave gifts unto men. The Father will bring us and gather us and free us from these prison cells, these bodies that we live in, and make us a name and a praise among all people of the earth, along with his chosen seed of Abraham. And so what a change, isn't it, from the beginning of the book? And you know, so much of what Zephaniah says in his book is reversed. Just consider, in chapter 1, verse 18, it described the whole land being devoured by the fire of his jealousy to make a speedy riddance. Well, in chapter 3, the earth is devoured by the fire of his jealousy to restore the nations. In chapter 1 at verse 5, they swear by the Lord and swear by Malcolm. But in this chapter, verse 9, they will call upon the name of the Lord with one consent. In chapter 3 and verse 3, the princes, they were roaring lions and full of pride. In verse 11, those who rejoice in pride are taken away. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. In chapter 1 and verse 4, he's going to cut off the remnant of Baal and the hypocrites. In chapter 3 and verse 12, he's going to leave a remnant who does not lie, in which there is no deceit. In chapter 3 and verse 2, it speaks of those who trusted not in the Lord. At verse 12, it speaks of those who shall trust in the Lord. And in chapter 1 and verse 14, there is the mighty man who would cry bitterly. And in chapter 3 at verse 17, there's the mighty man, the Lord, who would save. And lastly, in chapter 2 and verse 1, they're called a nation not desired. But then they're called the Lord who will rest in his love for his people. And Babylon would come to remove Israel from their land. But in chapter 3 and verse 10, the nations are going to return Israel to their land. So many things are changed and reversed in this prophecy. And so, brothers and sisters, let's summarize that we can't be, we should not be like the world and the people around us. We need to fear God and receive instructions from the way that he's dealt with them. Let us remember that God's in our midst, right in the middle, in our center of our lives, and that morning by morning he brings his judgment to light, if only we would avail of ourselves of them through his word. And when it seems that we're halting along in life, then all we can do is wait upon Yahweh. Be nailed to him and stuck to him, and wait with a longing and persevering expectation. And that our God is a jealous God, and he doesn't share his love with other than his people, and he demands that we love only him. And so may we learn from the words through Zephaniah that we might be found among those who were with Zephaniah, among those whom Yahweh hath hidden, on that great day of the Lord, soon to be upon us, a day of judgment and a day of love.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you found the episode helpful. Don't forget, most of these episodes are also available as videos on our video channel, cdvideo.org. So head over and take a look. If you have any comments or questions or suggestions, please get in touch or leave us a voice message. We love to hear your feedback. You can email us at btf@cdvideo.org. If you enjoyed the episode, then please share it with others. Until next time, may God bless you in your studies and your walk towards God's kingdom. Amen.